All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. This is your host, Dr. D. Today, we have an interview with Kris Liivam, the president of Arctic Fire Safety out of Alberta, Canada. He is an expert in the private sector response to wildland-urban interface, a safety consultant, and all-around incredible human being who's joining us today to talk about the role of contract firefighting in our wildland-urban interface fires. Grab your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. All right. Thanks again for joining us. We have this incredible interview with Kris. Let's get after it. All right, Kris, thank you very much for joining us on Inside My Canoe Head. It's a privilege to have you here. Why don't you go ahead and tell us who you are and what your company's all about?
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. So I've been involved in occupational health and safety since about 2000. I'm a Canadian registered safety professional. And back in 2015, back when L'Orange and Cold Lake were on fire, and we were also experiencing a recession in Alberta due to the decline in oil activity. And during that time, I noticed that Alberta was flying in a bunch of foreign firefighters. And being in the industry I'm in, I know that Alberta has a lot of private firefighting agencies and a lot of industrial firefighters. And my thought was, why can't we take these very well-trained gentlemen and retrain them to do wildland firefighting? So I challenged the government of the day very publicly on national television, and shortly thereafter, I was called in and we had a discussion about how to make this happen. So from that point forward, it's been an evolving task to incorporate industrial firefighters into the wildland and wildland urban interface situations. So 2015 is when I bought my first couple of fire trucks. And then 2016 was our first major fire where we were called in to help with the Fort McMurray Beast. Then we were also involved with the Waterton National Park fire. Well, then we were also up into High Level and Lacrete in 2019. Then last year, we were pretty much everywhere. We were in Drayton Valley, Northern Lights County, Grand Prairie County, Yellowhead County twice, Peavine Métis Settlement, Yellowknife, Mackenzie County, and I'm thinking there's a couple other ones we were at too. I just can't think of them off the top of my head.
And I mean, it sounds wonderful, but I'll be honest with you. There's I think there's a dearth of knowledge across emergency management professionals in the rest of Canada that certain parts of the country do use private sector companies in roles in emergency management. And it's something that I've been trying to talk a lot about, is to say that there's one sector of society, our corporate sector, that is highly underutilized, I would argue, in the employment, not just in the response and recovery phases, but also in the mitigation and preparedness phases. Do you see in your role in the private sector, do you see a lot of positive engagement with the public sector on this, or is there pushback from the public sector on engaging the private sector?
I think it's a little bit of both. I'm running into a situation now where public sector firefighting agencies are, for example, building sprinkler trailers, even though they're in southeastern Alberta and there's no trees down there. So they're building these units, taking up their limited resources to put themselves on export. And that to me is a little bit of a questionable decision, where in, say, southeastern Alberta, they could probably use a brush truck, which would cost just about as much as a sprinkler trailer, which they could use more readily than something that they're only building to send the guys out on export.
And I can tell you from my experience as a veteran, working in the ranges for a lot, we needed the bush trucks because firing a lot of ammunition in the military, you tend to periodically start forest fires. And every once in a while, a couple of them start to get a bit out of hand. They're actually a reasonably regular occurrence when you fire artillery shells. And we needed the appropriate equipment to deal with that because the standard fire truck or trailers or backpacks just were insufficient to deal with that. So I agree with you. A lot of it is about having the right equipment and being in the correct, having the relationships, I guess, built. Have you found it um, easy to build relationships with the public sector emergency managers when it comes to identifying yourself, demonstrating what services you provide? Is that been a reasonably less combative journey?
I think it's a little bit easier in Alberta because there is already a large private sector industry. Uh, because there's, I think, about a dozen oil field firefighting companies in Alberta, and most of the people that volunteer with small town fire departments also work for these companies. So there's already that intrinsic knowledge already there because they're already working in both places. But you look at British Columbia, for example, they have some of these oil field firefighting companies up in northeastern BC, but they have yet to be dispatched to any of the major fires that they've had in British Columbia. So definitely an easier job in Alberta than it is in British Columbia.
And one of the things that pops up, and I've talked to Public Safety Canada and a couple other organizations and advocated for this, and I did it on the Devolution panel to say one of the barriers always seems to be the profit motive, in that emergency management has this ideological viewpoint that the profit motive is wrong or against the tenets of public sector involvement. And my question is, though, my response to that always has been it is far more expensive to maintain unused public sector capacity than it is to hire private sector. Do you ever get pushback on the cost presented, or is it more an ideological position that gets struggled with?
Well, I charge the same rates as the municipalities. I go off the published Alberta Wildland Urban Interface Guideline rates. So the pushback isn't there because I'm charging the same rates as the municipal fire department that's right beside me. The only time that there was a bit of confusion was at the beginning of the season, was I was using British Columbia's rates because Alberta's rates weren't published at the time. So there was a bit of back and forth on the rates. They were essentially the same. It's just BC's rates were all in rate, where Alberta's rate is manpower is separate than equipment.
So when you look at that, where do you think the first step that we need to take? Yeah, where do you think the first step that we need to take is to bring more focus on the assets and resources that are available in the private sector and emergency management? Where would you like to see the first resources or effort employed to bring the private sector more into emergency management?
Well, there's a few ideas there. One idea would be to build an emergency response association for the contractors. So in the United States, they have something similar. I think they call it the Northwest Suppression Association or Wildland Suppression Association or something like that. So that would be one way to help introduce the public sector into this, but also formal engagements. So yeah, conferences or even just having meet and greets just to say, hey, this is what we could bring to the party. So for example, there's a new company in Alberta called Fire and Flood that was created after the Fort McMurray fire, where a company essentially took a bunch of fracking equipment, water pump equipment, and is transitioning that into wildland firefighting. So we're talking about massive 5,000 gallon per minute pumps. We're talking about 12-inch hose and having miles of it, having 4-inch irrigation sprinklers, being able to set up a defensive line to help protect the community. So, for example, in Drayton Valley last year, when the fire was coming towards that community, Fire and Flood was called up to help set up their water line to help protect that community from that fire from overrunning it. And that's just one really good example of how private industry is able to help assist with the public sector. But you even go back to Fort McMurray, where WestJet and Air Canada were being used with their spare capacity to fly people out as part of the evacuation process. You look at Fort McMurray as well, where evacuees that couldn't go south went north, and when you go north, there's no road anywhere. They were going to the oil sand camps, and in those oil sand camps, they were taking up the spare beds there, and even some workers were giving up their beds so families could stay together. So those are some examples that are already there that could be broadened out to help supplement other jurisdictions.
The oil and gas industry in Alberta is somewhat unique because they have all of these corporate private sector entities to support them, from logistics to medical to firefighting, et cetera. We here in Ontario have that, but it's in the ring of fire as we return to ring of fire in the northern Ontario, where all the mining and minerals are. And I think part of the problem is that is separated from the population centers. So the population centers don't understand the extent to which companies like yourself are already involved in firefighting on the corporate side and supporting the municipalities. Do you think it would benefit more if you were part of an education campaign with the public sector to make that better known to the population?
Well, I don't know if the general population needs to know the difference between a contract firefighter and a municipal firefighter, because essentially we have the same training. We're coming out with a similar equipped type of trucks. The only difference between myself and the municipal firefighter is the patch on my arm. Otherwise, we are doing the same job. We are out there doing the same thing. But the focus is really more on the emergency managers and the fire chiefs, just letting them know that we are a capacity boost. So I'm not out there to overtake their jobs. I'm not out there to bid a volunteer fire department to take over their jurisdiction. I'm there to just be more boots on the ground. And typically the guys I hire are actually volunteer firefighters from other halls. It's just their fire chief made the decision that they can't send their own resources out because they have to think of their own home turf first. So I'll grab 2 guys here, 2 guys there, and we'll make up an engine and we'll send that out. So we're not depleting the local capacity.
In all intents and purposes, that makes you a complementary service. You're not replacing anybody, and I think that's another point that is not well understood, at least from, I'll call it, the Southerners' perspective, where I live in Ontario, is that yourself and all of your employees are equally qualified firefighters, which is obviously something that is important to make sure everybody's trained to a reasonably same standard. Do you find that standardization across provinces causes issues periodically?
I like to refer to Canada as 13 different countries with one national flag. So especially when it comes to wildland firefighting, there's not one standard. So even though we have the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center being the overall federal agency for coordinating firefighting, each province has their own training standard. So for example, if you were a firefighter from New Brunswick and you wanted to transfer over to British Columbia, you'd have to completely go through their training course before you could go out there and fight fire in BC. And that creates a challenge for companies like myself because I can't afford to put guys through 13 different training courses. And in fact, I'm working with a national Indigenous entity to become a contractor for them, so I could just train myself to their standard and then be recognized in that regard, because then we're trained to one standard instead of trying to figure out the 13 different jurisdictions.
And that's interesting, because that's often common, the same as in the emergency management teams, incident command teams or incident management teams that get deployed interprovincially during emergencies, is that everybody commonly uses an ICS standard somewhat similar to ICS Canada's standard, but that standardization is not the same across the provinces. So we see the same. The question I'm just saying is that it's very common. The ICS is the same thing with the different management teams that go back and forth between the provinces, and they have those challenges. So from your perspective, how do we navigate creating a single national standard? Where do you think that needs to begin?
I think there needs to be some more cross-pollination. So, for example, when the Americans came up last year to become IMPs, they didn't just have everyone from Montana or everyone from California or everyone from Florida. They had their specialists coming in from different parts of the country and working together. So this way they could understand each person's different perspective, but also understanding what each state does. Whereas in Canada, we don't really have that yet. Each province has their own IMP for wildfire, and there's a few IMPs being built in Alberta right now that are specific to, well, they call them all hazards, but they're just from one jurisdiction. They're not cross-pollinating with each other, except for CanForce 2. And in that case, they could get a lot of different specialists in that group, but that's only one team. And if you have 5 or 6 events going on at the same time, like what happened last year, you really run out of specialists very quickly.
Yeah, and that's that part of the issue is across all of the domains is figuring out if we can't get a common standard agreed to, um, at least portions of it, and allow people, permit them to work in an additional field with their training, just accepting it is as is where is. And another prime example of that is in the military. When you move around, your spouse may have a profession. And for example, I worked in a hospital for 2.5 years in the military, and the nurses that get moved around, they get the spouses who are nurses now have automatic acceptance of their interprovincial qualifications, and they don't have to retest. So a nurse that moves from New Brunswick to Edmonton would automatically be accepted without further testing for full employment because they're moving to follow espouses. So we do see areas where governments are starting to allow the change. With the different standards across 13 different countries with one federal flag. And I love that analogy. Is there any significant differences in the qualifications that cause you concern, or is it just the qualification itself?
I guess the jurisdictional boundaries that are put up, and I think a lot of it has to do with protectionism, protecting the local agencies' jobs so that they don't get sourced out elsewhere, is kind of my opinion of what's happening. You take the advanced first aider training in Alberta, and that's not recognized in British Columbia unless you take a upgrader course. But Alberta accepts the occupational first aider level 3 as equivalent to advanced first aider. So there's not quite that quid pro quo where BC seems to have this extra standard, which is more of a revenue thing rather than just accepting qualifications on par. They're both an 80-hour first aid course. They all meet that CSA standard for first aid training, but BC seems to be dug into the belief that their qualifications are better, so they expect people to upgrade to their standard.
Yep, and that would cause all kinds of issues when people need to move around, especially like we were talking about before, about the idea is you have some of these locations. As we know, wildland fires don't respect borders, and they don't require passports, which means they may cross international borders up north, but they're also going to cross interprovincial jurisdiction. And so a fire that starts in northern Saskatchewan may end up in the Northwest Territories and burning in Alberta. And then you run into jurisdictional issues. When that happens, is there ever any significant problems when the fires start crossing provincial boundaries?
Actually, yes. Last year we found that with Northwest Territories. British Columbia and Alberta use same hose thread for 2.5-inch hose, and Northwest Territories uses another thread. So British Columbia and Alberta use BAT, and I believe, I can't remember if it was NS or NH thread that Northwest Territories uses. So when fire trucks were coming up from Alberta, from Calgary, Edmonton, the contractors, Farhead sent a tender up there, our thread was not compatible with their thread. So we had to fly in adapters so that we could actually hook up to each other's trucks. So that is just one good example of how Canada has 13 different countries, whereas the United States, they've got 50 some odd different states and territories, but they all use NH thread. So this way, if you're a fire truck from Florida, you're able to hook up to a fire truck from Texas or a fire truck from California. But we don't even seem to have a common hose thread for Canada, let alone common training.
So is anybody or any organization out there trying to lead the push for a common standard, or is this just something that companies like yourself and public sector agencies have to navigate, or are we on a pathway to a better coordinated system?
I'm not aware of any standardization taking place. Most agencies do follow NFPA for municipal firefighting, but even then, a WUI-M course, the Wildland Urban Interface member course, and it's been around for a few years now, but it's not an NFPA course. So that creates issues because most municipalities follow the NFPA standard. So this creates a divergent training program, and it's all to do with export opportunities within Alberta. So that creates challenges into itself because now you're adding a new element into an already standardized process.
Yeah, and like your previous reference to fiefdoms and protectionism that exists within the provincial governance systems make it difficult to navigate those difficulties when you have different priorities, different strategies, different equipment. You would almost think that this would be simple to solve, considering the FPT agreements we do have on the governance. But the more I spend time talking to the people involved with that, it seems like this is just a lot of conversation and less action on the ground. Would you characterize it the same way?
I would. There doesn't seem to be a driving national force or conversation yet to even standardize first responders. And I would have thought after COVID that would have been something that would have happened for at least the medical community. Because going back to what we were saying earlier about there being a private sector medical services in Alberta, mainly providing to the oil patch. British Columbia has the same thing too. There's tens of thousands of industrial first aiders. And you would think that there'd be some kind of movement after COVID or even during COVID to standardize this process. So this way you could take some of these advanced first aiders and take them over to Quebec. So this way we're not using your citizen home. You'd have people who are actually in the medical community who see this as a career for themselves, wanting to help out rather than retasking soldiers to change bedpans.
When the Public Sector Canada is looking at Public Safety Canada is looking at their current plan for building a civilian response force, medical training and medical assistance. Now, yes, it's geared a lot towards infectious diseases, et cetera, but it talks about pan-Canadian and ability to deploy pan-Canadian. But what it doesn't address is those employment standardization, qualification agreements, et cetera. Now, on a slightly different tangent, I lecture and teach in emergency management at the graduate level program. Do you think that's a good place where we can start introducing more discussion about the private sector?
Absolutely. I think that being able to let people see that the public sector isn't the only box where emergency services lay in would be a great example. So you take the United States as an example with FEMA. So FEMA is not just strictly a public sector agency. They interact a lot with the with the private sector. So for example, United Rentals, which has offices in Canada, obviously has offices in the United States, but they even have United Rentals has their own emergency response division that works very well with logistics. So if there's a hurricane in Florida, they're able to gather equipment that's not being used throughout their network to send down to Florida to help with building firms or digging sandbags or whatever the case is, whatever they need tools for. But they've already got that laid out ahead of time. So we take Canada, for example, if we're using these networks that are already in place, like United Rentals or Cat Rentals or some of these larger organizations, Hertz, and we task them to manage our stockpiles that we need to have, then that makes it a little bit easier to deploy these resources where we need them, in my opinion. So if we had a large stockpile in Alberta, a large stockpile in Ontario to service Western Canada and Central and Eastern Canada, then it becomes something where you would be picking up the phone and calling the rental agency and saying, hey, these are the resources I need. Then they could go within their network to pick it up and deploy it rather than, right now with Public Safety Canada, they used to have a stockpile of PPE for infectious disease, and just before COVID, they threw it all out and they didn't replace it. Whereas with the public sector or private sector, you set these limitations in there, you set the hard min-max requirement, you audit that, then we can ensure that we have those pieces in place. And the key part I'd say there's auditing to make sure they keep it there, because you need to trust but verify. So just because someone's a contractor doesn't necessarily mean they're a great contractor. So you always you put the contracts out there, but you need to double back and make sure, okay, this company says they have this type of equipment and this type of training. So let's go back and just audit to make sure they have what we specified in place.
Absolutely. I spent a career in supply chain management, and I absolutely understand those needs for stock taking the stockpiles. And the NESS that used to exist was from the Cold War, and it was built in something like slightly over 1,000 locations around Canada is where the PPE and other equipment was housed to mitigate against the combined effects of a global nuclear conflict, that the government would have some stockpiles that would survive. And of course, we've evolved significantly away from that, present politics aside, but we haven't updated the national emergency stockpile. And you're right, there's a great number of private sector industries that do this exceptionally well, far better than the public sector, and are positioned around the country with their own distribution networks. So I think, like you said, it is a combination of first understanding the capability and capacity that exists in the private sector first. I would argue that that's not well known. When I speak to emergency managers across the country and people in academia, they're not aware that you exist, to be blunt. Many do not know that there is contract firefighting being employed in dealing with wildland firefighting. That's just not something that's common knowledge. And I think making that common knowledge, but making the networks understood so that the public sector knows the private sector has these assets. And then, like you said, they can then be part of a plan, understand this goes forward. These are the things that are available in industry that may or may not be presently committed. And I've said before, and I've written before about issues we have where you will see a like City of Ottawa, for example. We get flooding in Ottawa River all the time, and they're calling for volunteers to come out to fill sandbags. We're sitting here, we've got thousands of construction workers with hundreds of pieces of heavy equipment that are building homes that could be shut down for a couple of days to move in to do this work on behalf of the city, but the city is hesitant or chooses not to contract with them. Instead, they try to handle about 1,000 volunteers that show up totally disorganized. So I think it's an awareness that you're out there, and I think it's an awareness of the capabilities and putting it together that works. So understanding that, and you said before, is there any push within the private industry to build an association that speaks on your behalf, for lack of a better term, a lobbyist firm?
So a few of us owners have talked to each other and like the idea, and I've talked to a couple others that are hesitant about it. Pretty much the challenge is because there's so few opportunities for work, except for last year. This industry is a little bit cutthroat in that regard. So there's not a lot of cooperation, and that creates a challenge for us because we're too busy chasing our own tails and not the government to dictate terms to us. Requires firefighting contractors to have wildland firefighting insurance, and the insurance industry pretty much says that's the equivalent of a jewelry thief insuring the jewels that they stole. They don't want to be in a position of having to pay a contractor to put out the fire that they caused. But that's something that Alberta Wildfire insists that a contractor needs to have in place.
To give you the floor and to give you the governance, what's the first thing that you would do if you were responsible for that coordination with the public and private sector? What's the first thing that you would mandate the government to do?
Set one training standard and sticking to it, because it is incredibly frustrating where, for example, in BC, they allow people to go on the fire line with a 2-day S100 course. And I have people from BC applying to come work for me, and the standard we have in Alberta is, well, it was NFPA 1051, now it's 1140, which is a 4-day course. So That, for example, creates confusion because I can't really hire people from out of province because they don't have the same training standard that I need here. And if we could just have one training standard that I could train people to, it saves me in cost, but also having that standardized understanding of what these people can do on the fire line. So in the United States, for example, they created a crosswalk course that allows a structural firefighter, a 10 or an NFPA firefighter to become a wildland firefighter by taking a 4-day crosswalk course. And that's what this 1140 is supposed to be doing. But wildfire agencies don't recognize that program to allow them to become wildland firefighters. So you've got agencies in Alberta, Parkland County, for example, that's asking the government, hey, let us take the CIFC Type 1 program. Let us become unit crew or have the qualifications to be unit crew or to be hill attack rather than a Type 2 firefighter, which is fire attack. This way they could do their own initial attack within their own wildland zones within their county. So once again, going back to jurisdiction, about 60% of the province of Alberta is under what's called the Forest Protection Zone, and that's managed by the province. But all the counties and municipalities are outside that zone. So if they have a major wildland fire, they don't necessarily have the proper qualifications to fight that fire. And that's being held up at the provincial level by essentially bureaucrats that are more interested in protectionism than they are in ensuring firefighter safety.
That's very interesting because it puts into play that the idea being is that the vast majority of the initial efforts that need to be done are within the capacity of the existing government to do. It's not a question of we need significant additional financial resources to overcome the primary or initial barrier. It's that we simply need people to build social capital. We need people to build relationships, understand and accept that each other has a role to play in this, and that work together so that those standards are there. There is a common standard, whatever it comes out to be, and it will always be something that makes some parties happy and some other parties unhappy, but at least a common standard seems to be something that's well within our frame to do that. Now, the question is, how would you best describe your corporate relationship with the provincial emergency management agency from the perspective of, do you work together in planning the year? Are you involved in the planning, or are you just there as a resource if necessary?
I'm just the hammer.
Perfect.
Yeah, I'm just the tool. They call us to go out there and provide the supplemental capacity that's needed. And then when they're done with us, we go back home. And I'm perfectly fine being in that category. But it would be nice to have some engagement just to say, okay, let's have a common training standard that's put in place. Like one really good example here of where this would really benefit us is the federal government spending millions of dollars right now on wildland firefighter training for First Nations, but they're only able to get trained to the Type 2 level, which is not necessarily interprovincial. There's only been a couple cases I could think of where Type 2 firefighters have ever left the province of Alberta. And to me, it's a waste of money and resources and time to train these firefighters and not even make them interprovincial. So if we could, like, a fire attack firefighter is a 7-day course and a hell attack firefighter is a 10-day course. Why can't we get these guys through this extra 3 days of training so they could be interprovincial? We've got thousands of First Nations firefighters across the country already. We don't need more of them. We need them to have qualifications that are accepted outside their home jurisdiction. So we don't have to bring in South Africans and Mexicans and New Zealanders and Australians. That's the part that bothers me the most, is that we have people who are trained, who want to work, and they're watching these fires on TV. That's probably what disgusts me the most.
So in essence, the governance barriers we have prevent our own internal integral resources from assisting us, forcing us to go outside the country and have foreign firefighters, well trained, well qualified, but come in. And I don't want to accuse anybody of looking for great PR hits, but I tell you, it's great watching those plane loads of firefighters arrive, because it gives the impression that governments are doing exceptional job of bringing in every possible and available resource to deal with the wildland fire, when, if I understand you correctly, those resources already reside in this country, but because of limitations and a couple of days of training, they're not employable, which unfortunately resonates with me in a number of other industries, that are different from emergency management, where we have that same type of difficulties in what I colloquially refer to as cross pollination of the businesses. That's pretty crazy. So we're gonna wrap this up with one more important question for you. If I was to give you the floor to talk to all of the governance ministers, what is it that you would say that we need to do to better ready the system for this wildfire season, which they think will be equivalent to or worse than the next?
If I were to talk to all the ministers at the same time, I would suggest that they reach out to the private sector, understand their capabilities. I would even suggest put a few of the contractors on retainer, because right now the current system of tapping on municipal fire departments to deplete their local capacity to help somebody else is robbing Peter to pay Paul. A really good example of how this failed, there was a municipality, I won't name it, that was in British Columbia that sent resources to Williams Lake back in 2017. Meanwhile, in their home jurisdiction, they sent their resources to Williams Lake. A fire occurred, which caused 30 homes to be destroyed and another 300 families to be evacuated for weeks on end. Not to say that the resources they sent out would have stopped the fire, but if you're a local taxpayer paying your county fire jurisdiction fees, those resources should be there to help protect you and not to go somewhere else. So the resources that left probably could have saved 3 or 4 more homes in their home jurisdiction, which would have been 3 or 4 more families that did not have to go through the heartache of losing their entire livelihoods. That part bothers me. Let's build up a capacity, but let's try and find a way to do it without stripping local municipalities from their own capabilities. And this is also creating a situation now where you've got municipal fire departments that are starting to act like for-profit agencies, which is then taking money from what they really should be building up on in their own community to go fight fires for the provincial level.
It very much sounds like we're in a position where we need surge capacity built into the system, but surge capacity identified as just that, and that your normal maintenance level or standard level of firefighting needs to be obviously maintained in your jurisdiction when you respond, when you send assets on a surge capacity. So I really appreciate you joining me here today. Is there anything else that you would like to say that I have missed before we wrap this up?
Well, I think that the concept of private firefighting, while it is a little bit foreign to Canada, has been around since the Holy Roman Empire. So it is not something that's new and different. It's just something that's been forgotten over the years. And I do think that there is opportunity there for the private sector and the public sector to work together. Like I said, we're just a blunt instrument out there to help you get the job done. And we don't take from the public sector resources. So let's say you're a community of 2,000 people and you've got a small fire hall of 6 or 4 fire trucks to go from, let's say, Comox up to Fort St. John in British Columbia, because that actually is a real example there. You're not taking away from one community to save another. By having the surge capacity and relying on contractors to provide it, it allows the communities to stay at home and protect themselves. It also creates for some of these people that want to go full time, rather than relying on volunteer fire departments to tax their resources. Because I think it's very well known that the Volunteer Fire Service Corps in Canada is depleting itself. What did the Fire Chiefs Association say? I think they lost 20,000 volunteers in the last 5 years. So by wearing these volunteers down even more, putting them on these exports for men, does not help Canada become more resilient to these fires. Instead, we're burning these people out and creating a lot of issues for them in their home life. Whereas where you get contractors and you hire people that know what they're getting themselves into, it creates a little bit more resilient program than constantly uh, breaking the emergency glass, trying to grab people from Hay River, or sorry, from Hay River, Alberta, and sending them to Fort Smith, British or Northwest Territories. So we need to really think about what we're doing as a country when it comes to emergency response. And I do agree with the idea of having a civil national response agency, but it should look at the private sector and how they could help supplement this, because they've already got equipment, they've already got manpower, and they're ready to go. Whereas if you try and build up an NGO from scratch, like let's say we task the Red Cross or Salvation Army to build up this force, they have to start from scratch. Whereas we already have these pieces in place within the private sector. It's just a matter of building up these conversations, figuring out the logistics, figuring out the contracts, and then it's just a matter of waiting until something happens and you can start deploying them.
And maintaining a set of relationships, I think, is an important key of that, of bringing the networks together and just educating Canadians and those that work in the public service about all of these additional resources that are available within the private sector that are there to complement and be a surge capacity for emergency management. And they're just, and I mean, when it gets down to it, this is a point that I try to make, and I think it's a great point to end on, is that corporations are residents of the communities. They're made up by people who live in the communities, and they want to work and help and protect the communities where they live, and to be able to be available to other communities to protect them. Corporations are people too, and they're made up of people who are residents. So thank you very much, Kris. I appreciate you taking the time to join us on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for letting me have a chance to express this opinion here. I know it's not a common opinion, but I do think that the private sector is here to help. And I think once we start tasking them more, you're going to see a lot larger surge capacity being built in that regard, because corporations, the people that go where the money is. Like for myself, last year I had 6 fire trucks. Now I have 9, because I took the profits I earned to make myself larger, to make myself more competitive, but to also provide more capacity to the profit.
And that is exactly what we want everybody to do. All right. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you so much, Jeff.